Uh-oh, there's gonna be trouble. Thompson's ready. He throws the left right. Taylor ducks. Oh, there's the kick. Thompson's down. Taylor wins.
And see through you, see your true colors.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And, you know, I was reading some of my comments and my videos yesterday, and one gentleman said, what are we doing here? Are we trying to solve this thing, or are we just reporting on things? And I said, you know, that's a fair point, except obviously they haven't followed me for very long, because I made a decision in this case a long time ago. And for those of you that have followed me for a long time, you know this, that when I first started, I was just giving my opinion on things. Then as time progressed, I noticed that if you were really going to be able to get to the truth in a complicated matter such as this, you can't just sit back and look at things and give your opinions. So I dove into the court record, started learning as much as I could about the law. And then I started learning as much as I could about DNA, forensic techniques, investigative genetic genealogy. I started learning as much as I could about the actual events around this, taking the evidence that we have, breaking it down in every manner possible, and reporting on the latest events in the case. And I think by hitting it from every single angle, it is the only way where you can really decipher what you're looking at to determine the difference between truth and fiction. And the reason I say that is because in this video, we're going to go through and continue to affirm what I've been saying for a while now, which is there is no way this freaking thing is over, because the advantages that the defense had against the prosecution in this case were tremendous. And I want to think that it was all planned out to have all of the advantages, but I think some things they may not even have noticed the advantage. So when something does finally happen, and we can all see, we can read the tea leaves, we know something's going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, I imagine it's going to be after the special prosecutor completes the investigation on the leaks. That's my best guess, but maybe not. It may happen further down the road, sooner than that. I don't know. I certainly am not going to cover this thing, you know, for the rest of my life waiting on something to happen, but I believe something's going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later. But I'm not on a timetable. We get to the truth, we get everything exposed in this case, and I'll move on until it does happen. But until then, we've got to continue to dig deep. But I'm noticing things that once this thing would have gone to trial, I'm seeing the game that the prosecution was going to play, especially with their experts, because it looks like based on the witness list, the trial exhibits from the defense, that this was going to be a majority of this case was going to be a battle of the experts, because the experts on the prosecution side had bumkus. They just really had bumkus. And the experts on the defense side were very strong. And I'm going to show you in this video exactly how strong some of them were. And the evidence that they were going to have to go through and refute was evidence that wasn't evidence at all. And one thing that I've done, for those of you that have followed me, is I've really tried to dive in on the expertise of experts that we identified for the defense in this case. Y'all know I've done extensive videos and research on, for instance, Stephen Becker, the defense's vehicle identification specialist, and his qualifications. I've done videos on the husband and wife team known as the Pedons and what their expertise was with Celebrite in comparison to the Barnharts for the prosecution. I've gone into detail history of for example, Cy Ray and Matthew Nodal, crime scene recreation specialist, specific crime scene recreation that he would do was gunshots. But I've gone into a lot of the experts, some of them that I haven't gone into because I didn't know who they were or what their expertise was. But now that I see the exhibit lists from the prosecution and the discovery from the defense on some of what their exhibit lists were going to be, we haven't seen their full exhibit list yet, I can really get an idea of what this trial would have looked like and how well the defense experts would have just slapped the living crap out of those prosecution experts. And it tells me that this was not a even playing field. So what I want to do in this one is I'm going to show you some of the prosecution exhibits that they were planning on using at trial. We can decipher exactly what they were going to try to do, much like with DNA under fingernails and everything else. I believe that they were going to try to use things like fingerprints found at the crime scene and try to say they were inconclusive as well. And the defense experts were going to refute that, and they would have won. And if it ever goes to trial, they will win. And I'll show you why in this one. Hold on to your hats, folks. Now, first of all, when we start going through the prosecution's list of exhibits they plan to use at trial, and we start focusing in just on things to do with the fingerprints, you'll see that they were going to get very extensive on fingerprints in this trial. And you'll see starting right here, we got forensic latent print examination, and it tells you the reports in these. Forensic Field Services Report 2, Jack Showalter fingerprint exemplars. Latent print examination reports 4 or 5, and it lists all these reports to do with fingerprints. Forensic latent print examination, report number 10, latent print examination, latent print examination. Forensic latent print examination, latent print, latent print, latent print, all examinations, latent print examination. Many different reports. Latent print examination, forensic services report, Hunter Johnson fingerprint exemplars, print examination, 40, 41. I mean, there's a ton to do with fingerprints. And these are the fingerprints that they lifted at the crime scene, which with all those reports, they didn't really get many fingerprints. And the fingerprints you can see are the lifts from the kitchen window, sliding glass door, and the door lock. So the pictures you see of the window that they took fingerprints of with the 2 hands and the face, it looked like pressed against the glass. The back sliding glass door and the lock on the sliding glass door apparently were the only fingerprints that the prosecution was going to focus in on anyways. But as we go through this, and we see that they took major crime prints, of course, from Bryan Kohberger. And they took prints from Connor Chestnut, which I still don't know who Connor Chestnut is. John Showalter, that's Jack. High resolution finger palm prints from MPD. That's obviously going to be for Kohberger. And then we get to the print exemplars for Emily Hunter, Jack Showalter, Connor Chestnut, Maddie Zanna, Ethan, and Kaylee. And then you got digital fingerprints for Bethany. And then that's all that's on the prosecution's exhibit list as it relates to fingerprints. So it's quite obvious, because they have all the exemplars in here, that they were going to try to claim in some way that the fingerprints that they could not match to anyone apparently probably couldn't be excluded as Bryan Kohberger's, even though they say he wore gloves. I'm sure that was going to be their strategy. And here's why I say that. Because when we go to the defense's discovery that they turned over to the prosecution surrounding some of their exhibits at the trial, and we get to the demonstrative exhibits, and it really gets into the defense experts. And specifically, when it gets to fingerprints, the defense expert, you see here, Bright Birnbaum, is going to do a PowerPoint presentation on how they take inked fingerprints, and then they're going to do a PowerPoint presentation on the ACE methodology, and then finally, comparison to exclude. So they were obviously going to educate the jury on how fingerprints are supposed to be taken, the procedures for the methodology behind fingerprints, and then finally showing where it excludes Bryan Kohberger as being a contributor to the fingerprints. And it's a shame they would have had to do all that at trial. But you can bet by them going through and refuting this evidence that it's Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints, in some way the prosecution was going to try to insinuate it could be Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints. Now let's talk about this for just a second, why the defense would have annihilated them with this argument. Now, when we go to the state's witness list, their fingerprint expert that was going to testify was Idaho State Police Lab fingerprint specialist Tara Martinez. You see here listed on their list. And right here, you see ISP Forensic Services, Tara M. Martinez, forensic scientist, and her specialty is latent print section. So she is an expert in latent prints comparing developing latent prints to known exemplars using the ACE-V documenting and reporting results. So that's the prosecution's expert. And when we go to the defense's expert, her name is Kathleen Bright Birnbaum. And just to show you, Bright Birnbaum PowerPoint. So what about Bright Birnbaum? Bright Birnbaum retired from the Pima County Sheriff's Department with over 36 years of service. Over those years, she served as a latent print examiner, automated fingerprint identification system site manager, forensic artist, and crime scene technician. Now, Kathleen has been an IAI certified latent print examiner since 1995, a contemporary of Pat Wertheim, who originally designed this course in the 80s. Miss Bright Birnbaum has been continuously updating the course since 2009 when she became its exclusive instructor. Miss Bright Birnbaum has been teaching fingerprint courses since 1980 and travels regularly to South Africa to present the advanced ridgeology science workshop to the South African Police Service. She has been published in magazines such as the Journal of Forensic Identification, Surveillance Security Magazine, and The Champion. Miss Bright Birnbaum has served on the editorial review board for the Journal of Forensic Identification since 2001. Since leaving the Sheriff's Department, Kathleen has continued to serve the criminal justice community through her company, Desert Forensics. Based in Tucson, Arizona, Desert Forensics provides independent forensic consulting services to attorneys throughout the U.S. and Canada. So this is Kathleen Bright Birnbaum, the defense expert on latent fingerprints. And she specifically is responsible for advancing what's known as the ACE-V process for fingerprint comparisons. And this is why I say the prosecution would have had no chance with their experts up against the defense experts. Because as you can see, Tara M. Martinez, who is using the ACE-V fingerprint elimination process, all they had to do was put her on the stand, and when comparing the expertise of the experts, ask her who taught her some of the things that she knew. And I'm sure they would have brought up the fact that advanced ridgeology forensic pieces, she took a 40-hour class, and her instructor in 2017 was Kathleen Bright Birnbaum. So when comparing expertise, you've got the student and the teacher going to battle. I think the teacher wins every time. What do you think? Now that's on the fingerprints. Then you have to move to the only evidence they had against Bryan Kohberger in the entire case, which was the DNA on the knife sheath. Now, it's clear from the experts that the defense was going to present at trial and what they were likely going to be testifying to, that they were not going to try to refute that it was Bryan Kohberger's DNA that was found on the knife sheath. They were going in the angle of DNA transfer, of touch DNA or trace DNA. I know when I say touch DNA, they said don't say touch, but it was trace DNA, and the way that trace DNA can be transferred from other things to an item. And if you think about it, I mean, that's the only course of action that they could have taken, because let's face it, either the DNA was transferred in some way from Kohberger to that knife sheath, or they did such a good job of providing Bryan Kohberger's DNA in the comparisons and eliminating all of the usable sample that was left of that comparison, that they had no choice but to attack DNA transfer, because there's no other way for them to explain how his DNA got on the knife sheath. And how his DNA got on the knife sheath was something that I'm sure prosecution couldn't explain either. Where'd the DNA that they went through all that with actually come from? That's the real question. But they were left with having to fight the DNA on the knife sheath through transfer. And you can tell that because of their witnesses and what they were going to testify to. And we've talked about a couple of them, and I'll mention a new one that I didn't know previously and what I found on him. But again, going to the modified exhibit list by the defense that they provided to the prosecution in discovery, and in the demonstrative section, the first one they had was connections demonstrative exhibit, and they don't have an expert next to them. This was an exhibit that was likely going to show that there was no connection from Bryan Kohberger to any of the victims, any of the, samples taken from his car, his apartment, anything. Nothing was connecting him to the actual victims. You can bet that was going to be a demonstrative exhibit showing that. But then you get to Ballard and her PowerPoint on DNA transfer in the University of Idaho case. And this would have been the transfer of trace DNA. And I've gone over Ballard with you before and her expertise, and it's absolutely in DNA transfer. And then she was going to do a PowerPoint understanding DNA transfer. So, and according to the court record and what we heard in oral argument, that the defense's expert was simply going to testify to how DNA can be transferred from item to item. And they were specifically requesting that the state's expert, which would have been Rylene Nolan in this case, testify to the science as well, that you cannot determine where DNA came from. You can just determine that DNA was found on an item, and they wanted her to be excluded from saying that there was so much DNA that it likely came from a direct touch of the item. And that was a partially won and partially lost argument. But seeing what the defense had in their exhibits here, we know that Dr. Ballard was going to testify to how DNA is transferred from an item to another item. And I went over this with you. This is Dr. Ruth Ballard, Dr. Ruth. And she's a human geneticist specializing in serology and DNA. And she specializes, if you go through and read everything about the transfer of DNA. And I've already covered this with you in another video, so I won't go over it again. But let's go to the next expert. The next expert was going to be a guy named Shuttler. And he was going to do a PowerPoint. Now, who is Shuttler? Well, when you go to the defense list of witnesses that they plan to call, you'll see right here is a guy named Gary Shuttler, who is a DNA expert. And here's what I found on Gary Shuttler and his expertise, and I really don't know what he would have been testifying to. That'll be interesting to learn. But I found this article from the Seattle Times, and I thought it was very interesting. Detective work in 2 states identifies 1979 slaying victim. And again, this is up in Seattle. And technology unknown when Tammy Vincent was killed linked the Washington teen to a body in California. On September 26, 1979, a girl's body was found on a beach in Marin County, California. The girl had been stabbed 43 times with an ice pick, her body doused with acetone and set on fire. She's been shot in the head as she tried to escape. For more than 27 years, no one knew who she was. But early this year, in an improbable twist to the long cold case, two teams of investigators working independently in Washington and California were able to piece together the mystery. Her name was Tammy Vincent. She was 17 when she was reported missing in Seattle in August of 1979. She had been subpoenaed to appear before an inquiry judge investigating a prostitution ring in the Seattle area, but she never appeared to testify. This is one thing I wanted to read this article for, because this is just another blatant example of law enforcement forcing people to be confidential informants and what happens to them. So she was subpoenaed to appear before an inquiry judge that was investigating a prostitution ring in Seattle, but she never appeared to testify. They got this lady killed. Marion County investigators now believe they have finally figured out what happened to her. The detectives say the answers, as well as possible future arrests, are rooted in Seattle's history of sex shops and in a prostitution ring that made headlines around the time of the Vincent's death. The break that led to Vincent's identification came from a rare DNA match that hinged on a single hair from the victim and a saliva swab from a relative. For Marion County Detective Steve Nash, who has been working on the case for nearly 6 years, it was a long-sought payoff. She was waiting to be found, he said. Now, Tammy Vincent was born in 1962 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her family soon moved to Okanogan County in Washington, where she grew up as a farm girl with a taste for adventure. Sandy Vincent, now 43, remembers when older sister Tammy rigged up a speedometer on her Schwinn 3-speed and went barreling down a steep hill chasing ground squirrels. She told me she was going 50 down that hill, she recalled. But her teenage years brought turmoil and fights with her parents, and Tammy Vincent left home at 16, ending up in a foster home in Spokane and then working as a prostitute in Seattle. In August 1979, King County Police raided a South 180th Street apartment they believed was a front for prostitution and found Vincent, then a 17-year-old runaway from the State Department of Social and Health Services. Vincent was put on a plane to Spokane 2 days after the raid and returned to DSHS there. But the following day, a caseworker called King County Police to report that she had run away. She was last seen in Seattle on September 10, 1979 at a motel in the 19200 block of Aurora Avenue North, getting into a silver Lincoln Continental owned by one of the suspects in the sex shop investigations. Detectives found out shortly after the sighting. On September 11, 1979, a King County judge signed a protective order that identified Vincent as a material witness and ordered her to testify in the ring and racketeering case against 5 men accused of forcing women and girls into prostitution. She never showed up. No kidding, because once y'all ordered her to come in and testify against those guys, they made sure she didn't show up. Good grief. The trial resulted in a mix of verdicts. One sex shop operator was sentenced in March 1980 to 5 years in prison for promoting prostitution. The others received sentences of up to 8 years in prison. Vincent's family knew nothing about the investigations. The last time they saw her was in the summer of 1979 when she showed up at a family home in a car with another person. She was different, said Sandy Vincent. She said a couple of things and I just walked away. She never even got out of the car. Sandy Vincent declined to explain exactly what was said. She heard from her sister one or more time later that summer. She called on the phone and said she wanted to come home. She was very scared. She knew her life was in danger. We never heard from her again. The family tried periodically to find her. They suspected she may have been killed by the Green River Killer and began contacting King County's Green River Task Force. The task force added Tammy Vincent to its investigation of missing women begun in the 1980s. In 2003, a family got a call from a King County deputy working with the task force asking if they could provide a DNA sample from a member of the family, something the task force began doing routinely. Sandy Vincent provided a saliva swab. The swab was forwarded to a national DNA library just being developed at the University of North Texas at Fort Worth. The university's Center for Human Identification stores information and conducts tests to identify human remains for the crime laboratories and in non-criminal cases. A match. Unknown to King County Police, detectives in Marin County had reopened the 1979 murder case in 2001, part of taking a fresh look at unsolved crimes. In reviewing old cold cases, detectives learned that a clerk at a San Francisco Woolworth store had vividly recalled a mysterious man in a white leisure suit coming into the store that summer with a girl about 5 feet 6 inches tall, about 125 pounds, with light brown afro-style hair, a match with Vincent's description. The man bought acetone, paint, and an ice pick, the clerk said. Detectives also went back through long stored evidence folders which had been moved through 4 evidence rooms over the decades. A single hair was found intact. The hair was sent in 2005 to the California Department of Justice and then to the Texas database in December. In February 2007, the results came back. 2 law enforcement agencies, independent of each other, had sent samples to the Texas lab hoping for a hit. They got one. The DNA from the hair matched the DNA sample provided by Tammy's family 4 years earlier. The California Department of Justice said it was the first time the state had matched remains found in California with a DNA sample from another state. That type of match was also pretty rare in Washington, said Dr. Gary Shuttler, State Patrol DNA technical leader. Remind you, this was back in 2007, and Gary Shuttler was the State Patrol DNA technical leader. So probably a pretty strong witness for the state in this, for the defense team in this one as well. And then it says Marion County detectives called Vincent's family in eastern Washington and said they wanted to meet them at their home. Sitting in their Moses Lake living room one evening earlier this year, Nash told the family that Tammy had been found. Tammy Vincent's cremated remains were returned to Washington State. She was buried in a cemetery that day in Ephrata. That was attended by 7 friends and family members. Her mother, Glenda Vincent, sat in a wheelchair, respiratory disease requiring her to use an oxygen tank. Nash and his partner, Jimmy Hickey, handed the family a small container with Tammy Vincent's remains. Sobbing broke the sunny afternoon silence as the family embraced one another. At least they found her, Glenda Vincent said. Now the family says they want one more piece in place. We want to see them caught, Sandy Vincent said. They've been living their lives to the fullest, and Tammy never got to live hers. We want justice. Nash said the investigation will continue. He and his partner have spent months since the identification, interviewing possible witnesses and suspects in at least 4 western states and in the Seattle area. Now they're asking for the public's help. The answers could be anywhere. It's got a lot of tentacles, Nash said. I think the answers are pretty clear. They know, and they knew back then, that they were forcing that young girl to testify against this ring of criminals, and it got her unalived. So what do? They bury it, and they try to say, well, maybe the Green River Killer did something to her. They knew back then, they know now, and this is my point about things like this. They will always cover up when something happens to a witness that they're forcing to testify, because that's what happens in the criminal world when you start breaking omerta. But anyway, that's an article I found with Gary Shuttler, defense expert on DNA. Not sure what he was going to testify to, but just another example of what was likely going to go on at trial with the battle of the experts between the defense experts and the prosecution experts, and another example of the superiority of the defense experts compared to the prosecution experts. That's why I say too much time and effort has been put into this thing, and everything that we see tells us that there's no way that Kohberger should have made that plea deal, which tells me there's a bigger plan in place. And anytime now we're going to hear something. All the tea leaves say it. But I wanted to go through and cover that because I have covered a lot of the experts in the past in this case, and seeing the new exhibit list from the defense, well, that portion of it, now we have a pretty good understanding of what was going to take place with that portion of their defense experts. Looks to me like the defense would have whooped the crap out of the prosecution as it relates to those subjects. But we're going to keep on digging and diving, because the more information they release, the more we're going to know. And we've got a bunch that was just released. So I'll continue to bring it to you until I cover it all. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.
Fly away. It's the first time